The idea of the myth of Versailles has been, I think, a really strong idea running through most of my work ever since I started 20 years ago, really, on this path. Um, and So it's nice to see people really discussing the myth, which I think 30 or 40 years ago might have been just dismissed as English people trying to dismiss the power of Versailles. So thank you everybody for this conference. I'm really sorry that I can't be there today. The context really for what I'm going to talk about, it's shifted slightly from what I proposed when we originally hoped this conference would start 2 years ago, as my intention was to spend several months in the archives in Nancy researching and preparing for this talk. That was going to be in the spring of 2020, then it was going to be the spring of 2021, and now here we are in January of 2022. So I haven't really been able to get into the archives to look specifically at one of the things that I wanted to. So much of what I'm going to say in the next 25 minutes or so is really about a broader story, partly because we heard a lot of the very specific details of the court of Lorraine yesterday by Thierry France. And I really liked what he had to say, because it was really based on the nuts and bolts of the floor plans, the designs, the decorations. So what I want to do is add a bit more broader context and look more at the people, the individual lives that were involved at the court of Lorraine. I think it's so important for this conference in particular because it's so much on the doorstep of France in the 18th century, that really the ultimate question of whether or not it's influenced or how much it's influenced by Versailles is really quite crucial. The other court, of course, that we would always need to look at in this context would be the court in Brussels. So I think more research needs to be done there of the governors general in Brussels. But anyway, let me get started so I don't run over time entirely today. In October of 1699, Elizabeth Charlotte, Duchess of Orleans, wrote to her relatives in Germany that her planned visit to see her daughter and her new son-in-law in the Duchy of Lorraine had to be cancelled due to insurmountable problems with etiquette, and complained that the king, Louis XIV, was being inflexible in his decision, dismissing her claims that the Duke of Lorraine should be treated as a sovereign with the comment, "The emperor's ceremonial is one thing and mine is another." The Duke, Leopold, had only been restored on his throne the year before and was attempting to construct a delicate balance between his Viennese upbringing and his position as a now very close neighbor of France, with a French princess, Elizabeth Charlotte's daughter, also named Elizabeth Charlotte, as his new duchess. Their new residence, Lunéville, constructed in the years that followed, is often today referred to as the Versailles of Lorraine. But as we have seen in the paper by Thierry France, the court culture established there by Duke Leopold and Duchess Elizabeth Charlotte was a conscious blending of traditions seen at both Versailles and the imperial court in Vienna. Even contemporaries provide conflicting viewpoints. The French envoy to the ducal court of Lorraine, Jean-Baptiste Godofrey, wrote back to Versailles that Leopold's court was totally German. But Voltaire, a few decades later, writes the opposite, saying that visiting Lunéville was just like being at Versailles. We must take into account, of course, that the famous writer was visiting the court a few decades after Godofrey's time there, and at the time of Leopold's son, Duke Francois III, that Francois was, even more than his father, considered to be too Austrian, having been schooled in Vienna and already anticipating his marriage to the Austrian Archduchess Maria Theresa, which would follow in 1736. This paper will therefore look at a different aspect of the court of Lorraine, not so much its architecture and its etiquette, but its people, from its dukes and princes to its pages and valets, to establish how much of the myth of Versailles can be seen in Lorraine's court culture, but also to identify how much Duke Leopold drew on his court's trans-regional characteristics, neither Bourbon nor Habsburg, neither fully Francophone nor Germanophone, in order to assure the survival of his small state. Over the last few days, we've thought about different aspects of the myth of Versailles. Though much has focused on the perceptions of Versailles by outsiders or the influences of Versailles on the art and architecture in non-French court cultures, If we go back to one of the original historiographical debates of the 1980s and 1990s, however, we remember that much of the myth was about people and about the relationship between the crown and the nobility of France. A number of historians effectively demonstrated that much of the idea of the gilded cage of Versailles was in fact a myth, and that the French nobility, rather than being tamed or neutered, retained quite a bit of its former power. My own research at the start of my career provided a working case study, in my case, the princes of the House of Lorraine, who resided at the court of Versailles, to demonstrate how the court aristocracy had found new means of expressing their power in tandem with, rather than opposition to, the absolute monarchy of Louis XIV. My interests then turned towards Lorraine itself and to questions of how the high nobility at this level could often function outside the limitations of the growing idea of the nation state. The transnational nobles, especially in the 18th century, felt at home in any court in Europe. They were thus trans-aulic, perhaps, rather than transnational. Here is part of the reason, of course, why so many court cultures we have looked at over the last 3 days were so easily labeled a very much like Versailles space. And if the chief driving force of these trans-aulic families was not an undivided loyalty to a nation state, then it had to be another force. And historians of recent years have really now begun to focus on the power of dynasticism as one of the chief engines driving European statecraft and diplomacy. And so this has led me to looking at the power of dynasticism at the level of small state princes, like the Dukes of Lorraine. Can we understand their political and diplomatic choices, often seemingly nonsensical or even contradictory, if we consider that their choices were based on less the survival of their state and more the survival of their dynasty? In other words, they were less modern than we often give them credit in terms of state building or nationalism. Historians of the past decade or so have revised our views on early modern princely statecraft and shifted away from asserting overtly conscious forms of state building, such as those that were stressed so heavily by 19th century étatiste historians. Well, of course, contemporaries did conflate a king's desire and a king's gloire with the interests of the nation. In this era of proto-nationalism, at the same time, the needs of the ruling dynasty were usually paramount, and important decisions could be made and were made based on the needs of the ruling family, without giving much thought about the needs of the people they ruled. This can be seen easily in the plans to carve up the Spanish monarchy by the great powers in the years preceding the War of Spanish Succession, or indeed in the plans to swap the Duchy of Lorraine for Tuscany in the 1730s, a plan that was not entirely new, as Duke Leopold had entertained similar ideas at the start of his reign, notably exchanging Lorraine for Milan or the southern Netherlands in the projects put forward to prevent the outbreak of war, anticipating the death of the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. So that's a fairly long preamble, sorry about that. In this talk, I will first examine the complex physical situation and characteristics of the court of Lorraine, a court at the crossroads between east and west, north and south. It attracted courtiers, merchants, and artists from all across Europe, and increasingly travelers from Great Britain on their grand tour, breaking their journey between England and Italy. As Jeremy Fillet has recently shown in his doctoral project completed last year, the Academy at Lunéville, established by Duke Leopold, had the double function of serving as a place of education for his own nobility, but also for these grand tourists, to bring international recognition to his duchy in the hopes that this recognition might equal support from the great powers should France try to once again occupy Lorraine and Bar. As a composite state with overlapping and indeed conflicting jurisdictions, we will look briefly at the territorial and cultural realities of Leopold's state and how this affected the composition and characteristics of this state and of his court. Finally, I will conclude by looking at how Leopold attempted to use his cosmopolitan or trans-aulic connections to preserve the neutrality of his duchy, to obtain a higher status for it, such as recognition as Altesse Royale, or having an independent bishopric. In the end, to preserve at least the independence of the dynasty, if not the state, through the marriage of his son to the Habsburg heiress. In the end, the blended court culture, neither Versailles nor Vienna, served to bring Leopold praise as a ruler, for example, by the young Frederick the Great, but was not sufficient to prevent the ultimate annexation of the duchy by France later in the century. Nevertheless, the dynasty itself survived and thrived, rebranded as the new House of Habsburg. So just a map to reposition us and remind us where the Duchy of Lorraine was. As you can see, it's quite fragmented. I'll show you more maps in other slides, and another nice manuscript version of the composite coat of arms of the Dukes of Lorraine. This one from the 15th century, so a bit early on, but reminding us that they make royal claims quite early to the kingdoms of Hungary, the kingdoms of Naples and Jerusalem, but also the ducal claims to Anjou, Lorraine, and Bar. So the question that I'm ultimately posing is, was the composite court culture all about survival of this state in a sort of untenuous way? There is a statement made by the regent, Orléans, that it's not really a question of whether Lorraine will be annexed by France, but when it will be annexed. So it is seen, I think, by almost all people as something that will ultimately happen. So trying to look at the Duke himself, focusing on Leopold, is sometimes problematic. His whole reign is in ways enigmatic. He wanted to be seen as a modern, enlightened ruler, normalizing the legal codes in Lorraine and Bar, but was also in some ways more absolute than the absolute monarch who lived next door, Louis XIV. This was due to the absence of most of the traditional noble organs of power, like the estates or a powerful clergy. He issued statements telling his subjects how much of a son of Lorraine he was, how his dynasty was rooted in the soil, yet he made it known to the great powers that he would decamp in an instant if he was offered the rich province of Lombardy instead. As has been recently explored by young scholars working in this area, Leopold was very loyal to his distant cousins and Catholic allies, the Stuarts. Yet even after he risked his diplomatic reputation by hosting the old pretender in his estates after the Treaty of Utrecht, he was nevertheless putting out feelers to the Hanoverian government in London to try to gain British support in case of future French aggression. Above all, he was a pragmatist, and this was evidenced in the floor plans and etiquette systems that we looked at yesterday in Thierry Franz's presentation. In many ways, Leopold was thus acting in a manner characteristic of his dynasty. In the 15th century, Lorraine dukes vacillated between pro- and anti-Burgundian stances, always hoping to stay on the good side of these powerful Valois princes. Brides sometimes came from France and sometimes came from neighboring states in the Holy Roman Empire, like the Palatinate. Balance was maintained. In the 16th century, the Duke of Lorraine used his close relations with the Valois monarchy of France to gain concessions from the emperor. After 1542, his state was neither a fully component part of the empire nor independent entirely, but it was a free, protected state. The Duke could participate in imperial wars and contribute taxes to its treasury pretty much as much or as little as he saw fit. This independence became more of a liability, however, in the 17th century, as tensions rose between France and the Empire, Protestants and Catholics. This time, when the Duke, Charles IV, tried to play both sides, he lost the gamble and was deemed too inconstant by both his enemies and allies alike. France occupied his duchies, but it was his ally, the King of Spain, who imprisoned him for several years in the 1650s. All this is to say that by the time the duchies were restored to the ruling family in 1697, Leopold had an exceedingly difficult situation for how to govern a state that was independent, but not too independent, and with a nobility that had its own ideas about the importance of court culture or loyalty to a ruling dynasty. So it's important to look at some of the broad characteristics in a sort of analyste way of the court nobility of Lorraine in the early 18th century to try to understand why Leopold might try to make his court more or less like Versailles. First, we remember feudal legacies. The Duke of Lorraine was happy to be included in representations about the power structures of the Holy Roman Empire. He was not one of the 7 electors, but was nevertheless one of the top territorial princes, as depicted in this image here from the 15th century. Lorraine is one of the 4, I don't know if you can see my arrow right in the center. Here's Lorraine. One of his more curious titles, dating all the way back to the early Middle Ages, was Marcio of the Empire, which better translates as Marcher Lord in charge of guarding the western flanks or marches of the empire from attacks by the King of France. The other great feudal legacy, of course, was the overlapping feudal jurisdictions and the wonderfully unique existence of the Barrois Mouvants, who you probably have heard of. The areas in pink are half of the Duchy of Bar, whereas the areas in yellow are the other half of the Duchy of Bar. So one duchy with two completely separate feudal overlordships. The parts within the jurisdiction of the King of France meant that the Duke had to go to Paris to pay homage, whereas the yellow parts meant he, in theory, had to pay homage to the emperor or was essentially an independent prince. Having a composite state with two capitals at Nancy and at Bar was complex enough. On top of that, as is well known, there were the three bishoprics, which, like most imperial ecclesiastical territories, had independently managed their affairs for centuries. But in this case, were occupied and then incorporated territories by the Kingdom of France. This is significant in many ways, and again influenced the way that Leopold ran his court, perhaps drawing more on the multipolar model of the imperial court rather than the more centralized French model. The spiritual lives of his subjects, for example, could be dictated by a bishop who was appointed by the King of France, notably in Toul, which had ecclesiastical jurisdiction over most of the duchy. Legal cases could be pulled from Leopold's sovereign courts into the French Parliament sitting in Metz. The urban elites of Metz, the largest city of the region, could dominate finance and trade beyond the control of the Duke. Elites thus had choices. They could either serve the ducal regime or the royal regime, or in many cases, they could serve both. But Lorraine's nobility had other differences. Looking very briefly at a language map, we see that the language divide between French and German ran right through the Duchy of Lorraine. We know that Duke Leopold had two secretaries, one for each language, but this affected more than just language. It was culture too. More research needs to be done on the cultural and social practices of the Lorraine nobility in this period, but it's apparent that the nobility from Lorraine's northeast quarter was closely connected to those of the Palatinate and the Rhineland. They practiced partible inheritance rather than primogeniture, and their daughters had to display 16 quarters of nobility before entering one of the prestigious convents like Remiremont or Épinal. Many French nobles fell far short of these requirements. So a setup for the ducal court where some of the aspects of daily life were done in private would have appealed to these Germanic nobles, many of whom had extensive kin networks, working at the courts of Heidelberg or Baden or Stuttgart. More about these in a moment. Focusing more closely on the personnel of the court of the Duke Leopold, a quick glance at his household accounts easily demonstrates how incredibly diverse his court was. Partly simply the result of circumstance, Leopold having been raised at an Austrian court, but partly, I would argue, the result of conscious choice. Leopold chose to maintain the diversity of his court as a political or diplomatic statement. He could have sent them home and drawn much more extensively on his wife's French network to fill his household staff. And of course, in many areas he did. Most of the members of the chambers or the kitchen staffs, certainly artists and architects, come from France, or at least French-speaking Lorraine. Looking through the lists of the stables, however, we see very different story. In this account from about 1710, we see the Comte des Armois from an old Lorraine noble family as master of the horse. Lamberty, his assistant, is a recent import into the nobility of Lorraine, his family having been part of the French occupation troops in the previous generation. Throckmorton is an English Catholic exile. Hunenstein is Hunolstein from Lorraine's northeast quadrant. Montaigu is from Burgundy. Dom Gaspar is probably from Spain, and so on and so on. Of the pages in the stables, some have names of the old Lorraine nobility, while others are clearly German imports, like Bettendorf here. But the most significantly different element of Leopold's stables were his Heiduc. And these were certainly very much a feature of the court of his parents in Innsbruck, obviously emulating the court of the emperor in Vienna. Hungarian warriors had accompanied Leopold to Lorraine when he recreated his court in 1698. Some had probably entered his father's service during the siege of Vienna in 1683, or the capture of Buda or Belgrade in the 1690s. Others joined Leopold's service as a young man when he himself served in imperial armies in Hungary. Precise identities cannot be made for most of these people, but at least one can be followed for several years, and indeed into the next generation, when the son of István Kereskeny is found in the service of Leopold's son, Charles Alexandre de Lorraine, in Brussels as Governor General of the Austrian Netherlands. That's the second to last name here, Stefan Kereskeny, appears often in later lists as late as the 1740s. So the question then is, why maintain such an elaborately diverse court? The reasons are probably multifaceted. Some is surely loyalty to reliable servants of the dynasty. This is certainly true for some of the leading members of Leopold's government, like the Irish nobles, the Earl of Carlingford, who served as his prime minister, or the Count O'Gara, who fulfilled sometimes quite dangerous diplomatic missions. Other top courtiers included Count Spada, Count Ferraris, Count Lunati Visconti, with strong familial links to Lombardy, where Leopold still hoped to press his claims to part of the Gonzaga succession in Mantua and Monferrato. Others were Frenchmen, whose family lands spanned the borders between France and Lorraine, and thus were extremely useful go-betweens. Families like Stainville and Choiseul will play parts in the histories of France and Lorraine for generations to come. Both of them have extensive links in both Champagne and Barrois, or families like the Beauvau-Craon, who had come to Lorraine from Anjou and maintained quite close links with their other cousins who remained Angevins. Another reason for having a cosmopolitan court like this may be the idea of emulating the imperial court. Like the ancient kings of the Near East, the emperor's title glittered because he was served by other princes. Leopold's court was interesting to visitors, for example, British nobles on their grand tour, as a crossroads of cultures. While there were already some princes at his court, like the locally based Princess of Salm, Leopold also worked hard to draw back his princely cousins from the court of Versailles. A number of the Lorraine Guise resettled in Nancy or at Lunéville at this point. He also worked very hard and spent a lot of money to raise up one of his own favorites, Marc de Beauvau-Craon, to the rank of an imperial prince in 1722, something to put him above the nobility of Versailles when he visited there as a ducal envoy. Duke Leopold used his diplomatic network with Vienna and Versailles to attempt formal diplomacy, remaining neutral in the War of Spanish Succession in spite of the reoccupation of his duchies, and offering his services as a mediator during the negotiations at Utrecht to end the War of Spanish Succession. To boost his ability to act on this princely stage, he assumed the style of Altesse Royale. He put this on his edicts, on his coins, on all of the artwork, which his ancestors had not used. In this way, he would match the rank of his wife, always something slightly awkward, and to which I alluded at the very start of this talk. Elizabeth Charlotte, Duchess of Orleans, could not pay a visit to her daughter or son-in-law because, according to the etiquette of Versailles, Leopold would not be given an armchair in her presence. The Duke's cousin and foster brother, the Emperor Joseph I, recognized Leopold as a royal highness, but the King of France refused. The regime of Queen Anne in London was interested in supporting Leopold, but not enough to risk breaking down the peace talks and ending the war. Leopold therefore turned to a more personal kind of diplomacy. He commissioned huge tapestries and paintings commemorating the victories of his father in Vienna, Belgrade, and Buda. He brought his father's body back from Innsbruck and staged an enormous state funeral. He maintained the memory of his mother, the Archduchess Eleonora Maria, who died just as his restoration began, and drew on her status not just as a Habsburg Archduchess and half-sister of the emperor, but also as a Dowager Queen of Poland, a woman with a fully royal title. The Polish-Lorraine connection, which of course would become a major feature in the period of Stanislas Leszczynski, has not been explored enough in this earlier period. There are some names on the household list that could well be Poles, but these are not clearly identified. Interestingly enough, there was an incognito visitor to the court of Lorraine, a much younger Stanislas Leszczynski, having lost his throne, who spent much of his time at Leopold's court as Count Kronstein. The second level of personal diplomacy was through his wife and his brothers. His wife, Elizabeth Charlotte d'Orléans, maintained regular correspondence with her mother and some of her friends, like the Marquise d'Olède, who in particular acted sometimes as a purchasing agent for the Duchess of Lorraine, sending her fabrics and fashions from France. Elizabeth Charlotte, like her father, Philippe d'Orléans, and her brother, the regent, was a fan of opera and helped stimulate the musical culture of the court of Lorraine. In this way, she aided in Leopold's efforts to draw back the old nobility of Lorraine to his court after dispersing during such a long occupation by France, nearly 70 years. On the other hand, Leopold's brothers were employed in the construction of a secundogeniture in the empire, clearly in emulation of the dynastic tactics employed by the Wittelsbachs in Bavaria, whose grasp on the electorate of Cologne was nearly complete. This goal was very nearly achieved when Karl Joseph was elected Elector of Trier in 1711, but he died a few short years later, and Leopold's own sons were still far too young to step into these shoes. Leopold's imperial connections were clear in other ways. He imported architects and designers for his opera house that were imperial favorites, more Italianate than French. He also employed a court composer who, although raised and trained in Paris, had spent most of his time in Spain and Italy and challenged the dominance of Lully and strict French classicism in his music for theater and chapel. Before concluding, it's worth looking once more at the map to remember that there were a number of courtiers who made the court of Lorraine different to that of Versailles, in that some of them were sovereign princes themselves. In the descriptions of the court by contemporaries, the old nobility of Lorraine were called the ancienne chevalerie, but these were simply called hautes hommes. Most of their principalities were very small, like Sayn, Leiningen-Dabo, Saarbrücken, Saarwerden, Hanau-Lichtenberg, or the Rheingrafen and their various territories. Some of these regularly lived at the court of Lorraine, and others visited only infrequently. They certainly made their presence known in the law courts of the ducal affairs, and the archives in Nancy are full of dossiers whereby these hautes hommes made sure that their sovereign rights were being respected. The princes of Salm in particular are worthy of closer study, as they were fairly close kin to the Duke, shared possession of some of his estates in the Vosges, and on more than one occasion were known to pass diplomatic messages to their kin in Vienna beneath the radar of formal diplomatic channels. It helped very much that the Emperor Joseph's tutor and surrogate father figure was Karl Theodor, Prince of Salm. In the end, the blended approach of looking east and west had its short and long-term payoffs. In the short term, a loyal aristocratic clan of a small state could rise higher than they might have if they had stayed at the French court at Versailles. The Prince of Beauvau-Craon, for example, was established in the highest non-royal rank possible as Prince of the Empire, which his family then took with them to Versailles later in the century, and it kept them at the top of the French aristocracy well into the 19th century. Beauvau-Craon's son Francois was named Primate of Lorraine in 1722, the highest ecclesiastical title possible in Lorraine, since a Lorraine bishopric was routinely denied them. Father and son dominated thus the political and ecclesiastical life of the duchy under Leopold's son, Duke Francis III. But when Francois left the duchy to marry Maria Theresa in Vienna, the Beauvau family followed him to Tuscany, and indeed ruled there in his name when he was absent, but afterwards did not follow him on to Vienna when he became Emperor Francis I. This is unusual because many of the Lorraine high nobility did go to Vienna and indeed remained at the centers of power in Habsburg monarchy, even as late as the late 19th century. You still have Lorraine people serving as foreign minister, et cetera, et cetera. The long-term success for the Beauvau-Craon family was at Versailles, not at Vienna, where they enjoyed premier rank, while the long-term success of the ruling house of Lorraine itself, recognized as royal by all the great powers by the 1720s, was also outside of Lorraine itself, as the new ruling house in the Austrian monarchy. Surely Duke Leopold did not plan for such an outcome when designing how much like or not like Versailles his restored court at Nancy or Lunéville would be, but he would surely have appreciated the ultimate outcome for his dynasty. Thank you very much.
Thank you.